I just heard recently that leaders of the separatist movement in Alberta have been meeting with American State Department officials. If that's true, and I think it is, then I think it tells us that the separatist movement in Alberta is going to pose a significant challenge to the federal government. Now, this isn't the first time that the country's had a separatist movement. Obviously, anyone who knows anything about Canada knows about Quebec. And at the moment, the Parti Québécois is leading in the polls in Quebec. It's going to be an election in October, I believe, of this year. And the Parti Québécois leader has promised a referendum on separation. Now, Quebec's already had two referendums in the past. Lost both of them, obviously. But the one in Alberta has a different dynamic because we're talking about possible coordination between some of those people who are leading the separatist movement and the United States. So they might have significant external support to do this. That wasn't really the case with Quebec. I mean, I'm sure there were people maybe in France who were somewhat sympathetic to the separatist movement. But this is going to be a whole other kettle of fish where you could talk about serious support in terms of money, in terms of support on social media for the separatist cause. And the separatist cause, too, is driven by something a little different, right? In the case of Quebec, the argument of the separatists there was that Quebec was a nation in its own right. In their view, Quebec is a country that is occupied by Canada. They feel that they've got their own unique history, their language, their culture, and they feel that they should have a right to self-determination, a right that the Canadian government has accepted, of course, because, again, they had two referendums, and that was respected by the country. So the basis for independence there was a sense of national identity, and yes, a sense of historical grievance that they were part of a political system that they thought they shouldn't be a part of on cultural grounds. Alberta is a different situation because the argument there is mostly about economics. Complaints being that Canada takes Alberta for granted, the sense that Alberta doesn't have enough of a voice in Ottawa because Alberta, remember, doesn't have as many seats as Quebec does or as Ontario does. So they feel that they are not listened to, and they have a huge fossil fuel industry. And that generates a lot of revenue, not just for Alberta, but for Canada. And they feel like they're making a big contribution to Canada as a whole, but are not being listened to as much as they feel they ought to, given the size of their contributions through their fossil fuel industry. So it's more of a kind of economic grievance rather than a sense of sort of historical injustice in the way that separatists in Quebec feel. That said, I don't know that there's very many people in Canada who find it all that convincing a reason to separate. I mean, I like in the case of Quebec, even if you felt that Quebec should remain part of Canada, you could kind of understand where they were coming from. In the case of Alberta, I haven't really heard very many people feel a lot of sympathy for that particular argument. But the worry is that grievance is felt by enough Albertans in order for them to be able to have a referendum. And if they have one, they'll have support from an external power, our next door neighbor, a country that is highly experienced in regime change operations around the world. So who knows what resources they might bring to bear on that and what consequences that could have on the Canadian Confederation. So far, we're hoping... Now, according to polls thus far, I think their support for separation is about 20%, if that. So it's significant, but it's obviously nowhere near enough to actually succeed in a referendum. But it might be enough to cause sufficient political chaos and difficulty at a time when there are other sort of priorities for the federal government to focus on, namely addressing the global breakdown, particularly around the interconnected economy that we have, particularly the tariff war with the United States primarily, but also just the restructuring of the world order. Now is not really the time for the federal government to spend vast amounts of time dealing with separatist movements within the country. But it looks like we might have two. I mean, if the Parti Québécois win and they decide that they want to go for a referendum in Quebec, that's a situation that Mark Carney will have to deal with, and then Alberta might have theirs. So now you're dealing with two provinces that want to separate. And if the American administration wants to, they can find ways of putting their thumb on the scale. Again, they have a lot of experience doing this. If they've done that kind of thing to a lot of other countries, and Canada might be on the receiving end of one of those this time around. So that's deeply disturbing. It was always a problem, really having a separatist movement in Alberta, but if it has a sympathy of the American administration, that makes it all the more, well, potentially all the more troubling for the country down the road. So 2026 um, might actually be the year where, well, all right, so Quebec won't be holding their referendum this year. I think their promise was to do it by 2030, assuming the Parti Québécois win. Again, they're leading in the polls, but Francois Legault, the leader of the premier of Quebec and the leader of the CAQ, has resigned. So whoever takes his place, it'll be interesting to see how he does. Now they've been doing, or she does, they've been doing pretty poorly in the polls. And then you've got the Liberals. They're also in trouble. They don't have a leader at the moment either. So depending on who ends up winning the leadership in both of those parties, we'll have to see if the polling numbers remain the same by the time October comes around. So, plenty of time for things to change, I suppose. But if the Parti Québécois maintain their lead and they win government, then yeah, that's going to be a huge headache. I don't know that there are very many people in the United States who are sympathetic to Quebec separating, but for cultural reasons, they'd be sympathetic to Alberta separating, I think. And that might end up being the real challenge ultimately.